From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The European Union agrees to ban Russian oil as President Biden says the U.S. won't send Ukrainian forces any rockets that can strike into Russian territory. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, two members of the Journal's editorial board, Joe Sternberg in London and Kate Batchelder-Odell here with me in the States. The European Union has been talking about banning Russian oil for some time, but now it is moving forward after placating some holdouts like Hungary. And here is Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, announcing the decision.
In the middle of the night, we decided then to have a ban now on de facto 90% of Russian oil imports to the European Union by the end of the year. And this comes at a time when we see that Russia has disrupted supplies to, by now, 5 member states. Finland, Bulgaria, and Poland, but now to a company in the Netherlands and to a company in Denmark. So our answer has to be very clear. How are we going to manage and what is the roadmap to really get rid of the dependency of Russian fossil fuels, and here with view to gas.
So just a few more details. Apparently there's going to be an exemption in the embargo for oil coming from Russia via pipelines. It will be phased in, and at the end of the year, it's supposed to cover about 90% of Russian oil imports. And there are also some other sanctions. For example, oil traders say that they're going to stop insuring tankers carrying Moscow's oil. So, Joe, how many cheers do you give this in terms of sanctions on Russia, and how much do you think that it will really squeeze Putin, especially since we know we live in a world where we have a global oil market?
I would probably give it about 1.5, maybe if I'm feeling generous, 2 cheers out of 3 cheers, because I think that it is politically significant that they have been able to get as far as they have. I mean, when this crisis in Ukraine started, when the war began back in February, it just seemed like European energy sanctions in any form were just going to be the Rubicon that they would not be able to cross because the economic dependence was so great, and the fear of a lot of political leaders within Europe about the economic consequences of cutting off these energy supplies was so great that it just didn't seem like something that they would be willing to do. So I think that the fact that they're talking about this at this point, and that they've gotten to the point where they can impose some form of embargo on Russian oil, is pretty noteworthy. I think that speaks to a certain amount of the popular pressure that a lot of people are getting from their voters back home, in the European member states about this issue. And on that score, it's notable that, I mean, as you pointed out, Kyle, technically the embargo only applies to oil that's imported by sea. And oil could continue to come from Russia via pipeline. And that would have only banned about 2/3 of the oil imports from Russia. You get up to that 90% figure that Ursula von der Leyen mentioned in that clip that we heard, because a couple of member states, notably Germany and Poland, have also said that they are going to voluntarily end their own pipeline imports. So you have a couple big economies going beyond the letter of these EU restrictions. And again, I think that speaks to the level of political pressure among voters at the grassroots for some kind of leadership on these energy issues from Europe the longer this crisis goes on.
But the main issue, it seems to me, is still these weapons shipments. And here the resolve seems to be flagging a little bit. And one example is there has been talk about the U.S. sending some rocket systems to Ukraine. And President Biden was asked about this at the White House on Monday. And here's what he said.
Are you going to send long-range rocket systems to Ukraine?
We're not going to send to Ukraine rocket systems that can strike into Russia.
So the Journal's editorial today is making the argument that this is suggesting some ambivalence on the part of President Biden. And Kate, what do you make of this and the idea that there are some rocket systems that can shoot not into Russian territory and some that can?
Well, Kyle, this is sort of a replay of the debate we had earlier this year about whether to give the Ukrainians a couple dozen Polish MiG fighter jets. The White House was wrapped around the axle about this as these are potentially offensive weapons that could strike into Russia, and we can't do that. And there was this fight at the National Security Council, really over-lawyering some of these weapons transfers and making some pretty tortured distinctions on how these weapons are used. So I think we're seeing a continuation of that, perhaps ambiguous ambivalence and misgivings about supplying the weapons that Ukraine really needs to evict the Russians from their territory, because that is what they're trying to do, Kyle. They are trying to get the Russians out of the eastern part of Ukraine. This question about striking into Russia is strange to me, given that, Russia has decided to invade a sovereign neighboring country. So look, we know that the Ukrainians have been asking for these rocket systems for some time now, and we know that they really could change the picture on the ground, given the Ukrainians don't have the ability to reach out and touch some of these Russian artillery positions that are just pummeling them on the ground. So this is a really disappointing turn. Hopefully the White House will walk it back and decide to give some of these rocket systems that could really make a difference. I think they'll have some pressure to do so from Congress, and we can talk more about that. But I do think here we are seeing this sort of muddled messaging and this reticence to do what Ukraine really needs. And as important as some of the energy restrictions will be, and I'm glad the Europeans are getting around to them, this battle will be won on the ground in the East. And so I think these rocket systems will be essential.
But I guess what I'm trying to ask, Kate, is the Biden administration making distinctions here that make much sense? Because we've shipped some helicopters to Ukraine, right? And if Ukraine wants to use those helicopters to fly over the border and attack, a Russian weapons depot that is over the border in Russian territory, Ukraine could do that. The same with the howitzers that we have sent to Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what the specific range on those is, but they can certainly shoot over the international borderline if they want to. And so, I mean, does this distinction that Biden is making between rocket systems and howitzers and helicopters, Kate, do you think that it makes much sense, or what is he getting at here?
No, Kyle, I don't think it makes much sense. The Pentagon has said that some allies have provided, for instance, aircraft parts for fighter jets that allowed Ukraine to get more of their fighter jets operational. So if those are offensive weapons, then I'm not sure how giving them parts is any better. I mean, because the truth is there's just no real distinction here. The White House is trying to make a distinction that doesn't really exist, and you can use these weapons. These are all offensive weapons. That's what weapons are, right? And so I don't think this tortured distinction really makes a difference. What I really think it is a fear of provocation. I think it really boils down to wanting to manage escalation with Putin. But we haven't seen any evidence yet that Putin responds to our reticence at all. So I think we can expect here that Putin is going to continue this war as long as he can sustain it. And he probably should be more concerned about what kind of weapons NATO is going to provide, rather than him continuing to dictate what we can and can't do and making veiled nuclear threats to try to scare off NATO. I think that's a really bad dynamic. And I think denying the rocket systems just feeds into this idea that we're still largely concerned about what he thinks versus about getting the Ukrainians the equipment they need to win in the country's east.
Well, I get the point about trying to not be provocative toward Vladimir Putin, but I just don't see how this is more provocative than any of the other weapon systems that we're providing or any of the other non-weapons assistance that we're giving Ukraine. I mean, Joe, there's been some reporting that the United States is providing all sorts of intelligence, including intelligence that has helped Ukraine target Russian generals, target the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet that Ukraine sank with apparently a pair of its own missiles, or one of its own missiles. And so what's your sense of these distinctions that the Biden administration is trying to draw? It seems to me that giving Ukraine intelligence about the locations of Russian assets is a more provocative move, potentially, than sending them some helicopters and some missiles.
I kind of interpret all of this palaver about the precise nature of the weapons that we're proposing to send them and what they could be used for. I think that's all actually a proxy for a different, more substantive argument that seems to be going on in a lot of capitals right now concerning what people want the end state of this conflict to be. And do leaders think that it is feasible at this point that Ukraine could actually win? What might a victory for Ukraine look like? And how supported should the West or NATO allies be of that kind of effort? And I mean, my read is that this is the big problem that the Biden administration still has 3 months into this conflict, is that they can't figure out if they think that it's possible for Ukraine to win, and they can't decide if they think that they should want Ukraine to win. And that concern, or that sort of vacillation, is becoming contagious. I mean, this is a big part of the problem over here in Europe, where you also have these big debates that are breaking out in a lot of places, especially Germany, about the volume and pace of weapons deliveries. And it all comes down, in the case of Germany, to whether Chancellor Olaf Scholz and other officials in Berlin actually think that they can, push forward and hope that Ukraine might win some kind of strategic victory here. And I think that if European allies are not getting some kind of leadership from Washington, if they are not hearing the Biden administration say, you know what, it is okay for us to want Ukraine to win this war, and it is okay for us to send the Ukrainians the weapons that they need that might help achieve that, you're only going to encourage more of this fearfulness in Europe that somehow they're provoking Vladimir Putin or creating all of these other risks for NATO if they kind of pursue strategy on weapons deliveries or sanctions or anything else that's oriented toward this idea of helping Ukraine to actually achieve a victory.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Before the break, Joe, you mentioned Germany, and I understand there's also been some controversy about these German tank shipments that were promised, and am I correct in saying that, as far as we know, the tanks still haven't rolled out to Ukraine?
Exactly. I mean, the tanks they said about a month or so ago that they were going to send, and this was after a lot of toing and froing and, gnashing of teeth and rending of garments about what they should send and what they shouldn't. And they announced that they were going to send their Cheetah tanks. And now, newspapers are calling these the slowest Cheetahs in the world because they have yet to appear in Ukraine. And, part of the problem is that I think that this, business of wanting to send weapons to Ukraine has exposed how underinvested European countries had been in their military for many years, because they're already starting to run into problems of potentially just not having the equipment on hand to send. But I also think that they're finding it very difficult, in the sense that they do face a lot of popular pressure from their voters who are outraged about events in Ukraine. Governments are under pressure to offer support, but they aren't necessarily getting a lot of reassurance from the Biden administration, from the U.S. that, this is really a NATO effort, that they're all singing from the same hymn sheet. They won't be exposed, any one of them individually, to Putin's ire if these deliveries continue. So I think that this is becoming a real problem, which is leading to a lot of delays on a lot of these deliveries that were announced with great fanfare over the past couple months.
And you've also done some reporting on German defense spending, and particularly these twin promises of a €100 billion special fund for procurement, and then that Germany would hit the NATO goal of spending 2% of its GDP on defense. And it seems like those promises now we are being told to read the fine print on. So what's the story there, Joe?
The story is that now there is fine print to read, because this all started back at the end of February when Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced this big turning point. He gave a speech to the Bundestag, the German parliament, on February 27th, and he announced this overhaul of German foreign policy, and the beefed up defense spending, the rearmament of Germany was going to be a big part of that. And they have finally, 3 months later, gotten around to agreeing amongst the four major parties in the country what the chancellor actually meant by that. And they've worked around to is this idea that they are going to ring fence €100 billion for hardware, for procurement. So this is a big victory, because almost as soon as he announced that there was going to be that special fund, there were a lot of concerns that it would end up getting siphoned off to foreign aid or green energy for, in the name of quote unquote energy security. So at least there's going to be real equipment, but they haven't quite been able to commit to hitting the 2% of GDP defense spending every year on top of that budget. So I think that the good news is that the Germans are going to buy things. This is a very important story for NATO, that one of the largest NATO members, certainly the largest economy in Europe, is going to be making more investment in actual equipment that will make it possible for them to do things. But they are still pretty politically far off from being able to make the kind of ongoing commitment in their budget every year that we're going to need to hope to see at some point.
And back in the U.S. in Congress, they approved the $40 billion aid package for Ukraine, but it seems, Kate, over some growing opposition, and particularly on the Republican side, 68 House and Senate Republicans voted no on that package last month. What are the arguments that they're making, and do you think that as this conflict continues, as it goes from a short-term thing into a months-long drag-out fight, I mean, do you think that there are people in Congress in the U.S. who are sort of losing interest and losing their resolve to help Ukraine stand up to this aggression?
Yeah, Kyle, I think that's a real risk, and it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy if we start to slow down what we're doing, and then we'll start to read more about how much the Ukrainians are struggling, and then it'll be harder to summon the political will to get them more weapons. So I do think that is a real risk. Now, to your question about this kind of rump faction of the GOP that voted against the Ukraine bill, I think the most common argument is that we need to focus on domestic problems such as the chaos at the border. And, I don't think anyone disputes that those are worthy priorities, but America has always had domestic problems and has still maintained its role in the world at the same time. So I don't think it checks out that Congress can't manage two crises at once. If anything, Kyle, I think when Congress tries to, pass these huge bills that try to cover a bunch of stuff at once, the eventual legislation is worse. So I think Congress can focus on, we're going to look at what weapons Ukraine needs in this package. We're going to sort out our differences over the border in this vehicle. I think that's a healthier way, and it helps voters understand what the real differences and arguments are. So I don't think that is a productive approach either. And I'd add one other thing here, Kyle, that I found a little bit ironic in some of these complaints about not putting America first, which is one of the common refrains here, which is that we need to put America first. Well, billions in this package go to refilling U.S. weapons stocks. It's hard to really overstate, Kyle. We have really drained down our Stinger air missiles, our Javelin anti-tank missiles. I mean, we're talking about a quarter or a third of those kind of inventories are starting to really come down. And it's going to take some time to backfill what we sent to Ukraine already. So this bill really largely got started on that work. And that is really important as an America first priority. The second thing I'd add to that too is that, the $40 billion price tag attracted a lot of attention as being too large, being, this is just so much money. It's a huge infusion into Ukraine. As you know quite well, it's basically a rounding error in some of the COVID bills that passed over the past couple of years. But also, Congress has been doing these kind of piecemeal appropriations for weapons systems for Ukraine that really keep us from having those larger scale efficiencies, right? I mean, you want to be able to send some weapons at scale because they're trying to execute these combined arms operations. So it really is just a more efficient way to do business to have Congress give a bigger number at once instead of just every few months coming back to the well and ending up at the same number, 40 billion anyway. So I do think, Kyle, overall, some of those arguments are misplaced. I think Congress can focus on more than one task at a time. And I was pleased to see that overall, it held up the bill for a few days, but it did not preclude the bill from passing and continues to be what seems to be a vocal minority of the Republican Party.
But Joe, to your point about the lack of clarity on the desired outcome here, it seems to me that in recent days we have seen Russia consolidate some of its gains in eastern Ukraine particularly, and that the war could turn quickly. It's not out of the question, I don't think, that Russia could decide to pursue another assault on the capital of Kiev if it decides it has the capability to do that. And notable that former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger recently suggested Ukraine might need to cede some territory in order to get peace, and President Vladimir Zelensky ruling that out very forcefully. And so, Joe, I mean, what is the likely outcome we're going to see here? Or does it really depend on how successful Ukrainian forces are in pushing back or stopping the Russian consolidation in eastern Ukraine?
A lot of this is going to hinge on decisions that people are going to make in the next few weeks, I would think, if that long, about the amount of support, military aid we are prepared to offer to the Ukrainians, because I think that we do seem to be reaching a stage where it is potentially going to become a bit harder for the Ukrainians to push back the Russians from some of the positions that the Russians have now been able to consolidate. And that is going to have a lot of implications for what peace might look like at the end of this. I mean, I certainly think that an ideal scenario, and probably what the Ukrainian government would wish for, would actually to be able to push the Russians back outside of Ukraine's pre-2014 border. And so you would kind of undo the occupations in the east and Crimea happened in 2014 and restore proper Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, if that turns out not to be viable, then the next best thing I would think would be to at least push the Russians back to the line that they were at the beginning of this war back in February. But none of that is going to be possible without this kind of military support and aid that the Ukrainians are asking for at this point. And I really think that it is in the West's interest to allow the Ukrainians to try to push back as close as they can to that line, because you don't want to create a situation where you've ended up rewarding Vladimir Putin for this invasion by allowing him to bargain for even a square foot more territory than he had at the beginning of this invasion. And so I think that that is a key point that we really shouldn't lose sight of, although I think that sometimes there is a danger. Western leaders, particularly in Europe, are in danger of losing sight of the strategic importance of kind of not rewarding Putin for this invasion. When they talk about this idea of kind of a negotiation that might give him some sort of face-saving settlement or a little bit additional territory now for the sake of having a ceasefire.
But it seems to me that at the very least, those kind of choices need to be up to Ukraine's leaders, Ukrainian people, and just to underline the point about the entrenchment of the Russian forces, the Journal's news pages are reporting today that Russian state media are explaining that some stores in Ukrainian cities, eastern Ukrainian cities, are now accepting the Russian ruble. And so they seem, Kate, intent to stay there. And what's your read, I guess, of the outcome that Western leaders should be able to expect or to be pushed for?
Well, I share your view that I think this is what the objectives are largely up to the Ukrainians, and also that you are seeing the Russians try to set up, little provincial governments and other outposts that suggest they plan to stay in the area. So I don't think that's acceptable to the Ukrainians. I think they've made that very clear, and I think they've made their willingness to fight particularly clear, and that they plan to sustain that provided we can give them the tools for the job, as we've been saying using the World War II phrase. I do think that these next few weeks will be crucial for how much they're able to do in the eastern part of the country. We've had a really big opening here after the Russians withdrew from Kiev to get the Ukrainians ready for this brutal fight in the east and to give them as the best chance at success possible. And I do think the goal should be for them to win, for them to evict the Russians out of their sovereign territory. And for that, we really will have to start getting more serious about speeding up these weapons shipments and also making them both larger and more capable. That's why I think the rocket system debate has been so disappointing, because it has gone on for so long. And, it takes some time. It'll take some time to train the Ukrainians on these rocket systems. And if we had started a lot sooner, we'd be in a different position now. So the real risk, the longer this drags on, the more ambivalence the U.S. shows, is that the Russians have time to dig in and they become that much harder to evict. So I think we are still in a crucial period of the war. The Pentagon's been describing it as a very dynamic fight that's changing day to day on who holds what territory. But I think the NATO job and goal is to help them win, because the Ukrainians are really doing the U.S. a favor by doing some of this brutal fighting. That means NATO won't have to someday do it in their territory. So I think those should be the objectives. I take a dim view of people intervening into this with their own views of what Ukraine should accept. And I think that should largely be the NATO position as well.
Thank you, Kate and Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.